Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. I was looking for an old article about melting Arctic ice and stumbled upon this one from 2011. It was written by Michael Schlesinger, who was a professor at the University of Illinois. Ice loss a growing concern. Open Arctic Ocean predicted to speed up climate warming. Strange things are happening at the top of the Earth. Remember that last line. I'll be coming back to it at the end of the presentation. Strange things are happening at the top of the Earth. The article had a mandatory polar bear picture and had a graph of Arctic sea ice melting since the 1960s. Most of this video is about the accuracy of this graph. I'll come back to that graph later, but first let's talk about Michael Schlesinger. He passed away last year from a heart attack. And this was one of the articles which was written about him at the time of his passing. Schlesinger studied climate change and global warming at UCLA in the 1960s and went around trying to stop companies from polluting, even though nobody knew what global warming was at the time. Everyone just thought he was crazy, and he went on to do all this research to really open everyone's eyes, and now climate change is really recognized as a tremendous thing that we must pay attention to around the world. He really made a significant impact there. Professor Schlesinger was one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with. As a professor, he was very demanding of his graduate students, always insisting on the highest quality work, and as a result, his students have gone on to very successful careers. Sounds very impressive. Now let's look at the quality of his work. Here's a close-up of his Arctic sea ice graph. It shows that Arctic sea ice peaked in the 1960s and has been declining linearly ever since. Let's look at that in some detail. This was the Arctic sea ice graph from the 1985 DOE report, projecting the climatic effects of increasing carbon dioxide. This report was the predecessor to the UN IPCC report. That graph showed there was a peak in Arctic ice in the 1920s, then a sharp decline into the 1950s, an increase in ice until the 1960s, and then it started to decline again. The graph was made by a well-known scientist named Vinnikov. Vinnikov extended his graph to 1990 in the 1990 IPCC report. As you can see, Arctic sea ice extent increased rapidly during the 1970s, and extent was considerably higher in 1990 than it was in the early 1970s. The 1990 IPCC graph was made using satellite observations. This was the text accompanying the graph in the 1990 IPCC report. Satellite observations have been used to map sea ice extent routinely since the early 1970s. The American Navy Joint Ice Center has produced weekly charts which have been digitized by NOAA. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. So in this chart I combined the 1985 DOE graph with the 1990 IPCC graph. The scale is identical on both axes. You can see that there was no net change in Arctic sea ice extent from the peak in the 1960s until 1990. You can also see that there was a large increase from the 1950s to 1990. And very importantly, the peak in Arctic sea ice occurred in 1979. That's a key date. Now let's compare the Vinnikov graphs to Schlesinger's graph. Schlesinger shows 2 million square kilometers of ice loss from the 1960s to 1990. But Vinnikov showed no loss from the 1960s to 1990. It was widely reported during the 1970s that Arctic sea ice was expanding. Chicago Tribune, March 2, 1975. New ice age on way soon. In the last decade, the Arctic ice and snowcap has expanded 12%, and for the first time in the century, ships making for Iceland ports have been impeded by drifting ice. And the 1990 IPCC report also confirmed this. In 1972 to 1975, sea ice extent was significantly less. On this chart, I overlaid Schlesinger's graph on top of the 1985 DOE graph. Schlesinger showed nearly 50% more ice during the 1960s than the DOE report. So I normalized the two graphs by sliding Schlesinger's graph down the y-axis. As you can see, the shape from 1960 through the mid-1970s was fairly similar. Here is a close-up of that period. But after the mid-1970s, suddenly there's a massive divergence. In this chart, I've added in the 1990 IPCC graph in blue. The satellite data in the IPCC graph showed a sharp increase in Arctic sea ice after the mid-1970s, whereas Schlesinger started showing a sharp decrease. So where did Schlesinger get his data from? It looks like he simply made it up. His graph doesn't bear any resemblance to reality. It looks a lot more like propaganda than science. Professor Schlesinger was one of the most intelligent people I've ever worked with. As a professor, he was always very demanding of his graduate students, always insisting on the highest quality work. Well, apparently in climate science academia, quality means its propaganda value. Now let's look at something else from his article. Strange things are happening at the top of the Earth. Well, here's the same article from 1922. Strange things happening in the frozen Arctic. And in 1923, North Pole melting. Many glaciers vanished. Is the North Pole going to melt entirely? Are the Arctic regions warming up with the prospect of a great climatic change in that part of the world? Science is asking these questions. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions with hitherto unheard of high temperatures on that part of the Earth's surface. So what Schlesinger was seeing in the Arctic was a cycle which also occurred 100 years ago. It has nothing to do with carbon dioxide levels. CO2 levels are very low in 1923. Now let's go to the next phase of this story. This is the NOAA Arctic sea ice graph from their Arctic Climate Report Card. Notice how it starts in 1979 and shows a linear downward trend since 1979. How did they pick 1979 for their start date? Well, that's an easy one. 1979 was the peak sea ice for the past century. By starting their graph in 1979, they can make it look like there's a linear downwards trend rather than the cyclical behavior which is actually occurring. This is the standard climate science cherry-picking fraud which we see over and over again. Now let's look at what sea ice has done for the past 13 years since the start of MASI records. MASI is the Multi-Agency Sea Ice Index. The red line is the 365-day centered mean. You can see that there's been essentially no trend in Arctic sea ice over the last 13 years. This doesn't look much like a meltdown. Now let's look at what our leading Arctic experts have been forecasting since the year 2006. 2008, expert, Arctic polar ice cap may disappear this summer. National Geographic News, June 20th, 2008. North Pole may be ice-free for the first time this summer. Based on these forecasts from experts, in 2008, the swimmer Lewis Pugh attempted to kayak to the North Pole. He made it less than 20 miles out of Svalbard before he got stuck in the ice and had to turn around and go back. 2007, could all Arctic ice be gone by 2012? Satellite images say it might be. The Arctic is screaming, said Mark Cerise, senior scientist of the government's Snow and Ice Data Center in Boulder, Colorado. NASA climate scientist Jay Zwally said, at this rate the Arctic Ocean could be nearly ice-free at the end of summer by 2012, much faster than previous predictions. National Geographic News, December 12, 2007. Arctic sea ice gone in summer within 5 years. BBC News, December 12, 2007. Arctic summer is ice-free by 2013. In the end, it will just melt away quite suddenly. Nobel laureate Al Gore. Polar ice cap may disappear by summer 2014. June 24, 2008. We see a tipping point occurring right before our eyes, Hansen told the AP before the luncheon. The Arctic is the first tipping point and it's occurring exactly the way we said it would. Hansen, echoing work by other scientists, said that in 5 to 10 years, the Arctic will be free of ice in the summer. Representative Ed Markey, Democrat Massachusetts committee chairman, said, Dr. Hansen was right. 20 years later, we recognize him as a climate prophet. Well, the climate prophet predicted the Arctic would be ice-free between 2013 and 2018. Our leading experts from the Naval Postgraduate School and NASA made this very sciencey looking graph which showed the Arctic ice-free in 2014. The Sierra Club said Arctic ice would be gone in 2013. Cambridge University's leading expert Peter Wadham said the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015 and would cause a methane catastrophe. Journalist Mark Hartsgaard predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015. Say goodbye to polar bears and a whole lot of ice. Peter Wadhams from Cambridge University missed on his 2015 forecast, so he simply pushed it back to 2017 or 2018. Once again, let's look at what's actually happened to Arctic sea ice since 2006, when the experts started making these catastrophic predictions. Well, nothing has happened at all. These experts have absolutely no clue what they're talking about. They've demonstrated that they can't predict the future. They've also shown that they can't accurately report the past. They're no good at science, so what are they good for? Well, propaganda, of course. Let's look at this first paragraph about Schlesinger again. Schlesinger studied climate change and global warming at UCLA in the 1960s and went around trying to stop companies from polluting. Well, fossil fuel companies don't generate CO2, we do. The billions of people around the world who depend on fossil fuels for their day-to-day survival, they're the ones generating the carbon dioxide. Not the oil companies, it's us. We can't survive without it. Climate alarmists seem to have completely lost sight of this fact. They've used a 16-year-old girl to motivate millions of people to travel all over the world protesting fossil fuels. Greta has directly created a massive carbon footprint by organizing all of these protests. It's clear that whatever is going on here has nothing to do with atmospheric CO2 levels, and it has nothing to do with climate. It's about shutting down U.S. energy companies. We need to find out who's financing and organizing all of this misinformation. Visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.